LEGO Racers, developed by High Voltage Software and released October 22, 1999, was another attempt from LEGO to assert itself into the video game world. Taking aspects from games like Mario Kart and Diddy Kong Racing, LEGO Racers is one of the more noteworthy racing games on the N64. At the time of its release, it received mixed reviews from critics, but how does it fare today? Believe it or not, LEGO Racers has a story mode, but much like Diddy Kong Racing, it relies on the manual to do the storytelling for the most part. Rocket Racer is the greatest racer in Legoland, and he's upset because him being so good has bored him. His solution? Making a bunch of circuits where other races from all around the world in different time periods can compete to really give him a challenge, and you're here to give him that challenge. Skit. Like I said before, the story is pretty much just in the manual. In the game, we get some cutscenes of rival characters that show off their personalities, but there's not a real story told, and that's fine. It's more effort than something like Mario Kart, but Mario Kart also doesn't call for a story. This is just kind of a bonus. The circuit mode in LEGO Racers is kind of interesting. At first glance, it appears to be a regular circuit mode. You can see that there are 7 circuits in total, but as you start to play them, you'll notice that it's not really 7 separate circuits. The first 3 circuits are pretty much what you'd expect. They're a series of 4 races all on different tracks, but once you get to the 4th circuit, you'll notice that the game implements a mirror mode for the next 3 circuits. The 7th circuit is pretty much just a race on one stage against Rocket Racer and some buddies. Overall, the circuit mode is pretty good, but it's kind of weird to me that you get mirror mode in this way. Other racing games that I've played, if they have a mirror mode, will usually force you to beat the game in its entirety, and mirror modes are usually just a bonus. So when I saw that there were 7 circuits in total, I thought I was actually getting a buttload of tracks, but instead, I got about 13. In reality, that isn't bad, but my point is that having the mirror modes be a main part of the game kind of feels uncreative and lazy, which is something that I thought I'd never say about a LEGO game. Once again, I don't necessarily think that having the mirror mode in this fashion is inherently bad, but I also think it doesn't do the game any good. It's glorified padding. The tracks in LEGO Racers are kind of a mixed bag. There aren't really any tracks that are flat out horrible, and with that said, there aren't any great, wonderful tracks either. Most of the tracks are good enough. One thing that is really good about LEGO Racers is how it implements its shortcuts. A lot of the stages have shortcuts, and shortcuts that are pretty easy to use and worth being used. They're also pretty creative. For example, in the first stage, Imperial Grand Prix, you actually have to use your cannon item to open up the shortcut, and then you can take it. The fact that you have to interact with the world with an item before actually taking the shortcut is pretty interesting in comparison to how Diddy Kong Racing or Mario Kart did it. Some of the shortcuts in LEGO Racers are ones that you wouldn't really be able to take on your first lap, but rather just take note of, and in the second and third laps, you can actually take the shortcut. I feel like that kind of design adds a sense of replayability to the tracks. Even with the good shortcuts and decent designed tracks as it is, there aren't a lot of memorable or noteworthy tracks. Tracks in LEGO Racers just kind of get the job done. They have intriguing ideas, and there really isn't a dull track when it comes to its aesthetic, but there wasn't really any point that I felt like I was observing excellent design. The most memorable tracks for me are ones with horrible stage hazards like Nightmare-a-thon and Alien Rally Asteroid. How did the UFO get me? I call hacks. Skit. So the tracks are okay, and that's okay. But what about the other really vital part about a racing game? What about the controls? This is where I take issue with LEGO Racers, and this is where most of my frustration with the game is placed. The button mapping is fine. You move with the control stick, accelerate with A, brake and reverse with B, slide with R, and use your item with Z. Easy enough, and just the way I like my racing games that are in this style. The problem is that most of the vehicles control all ding-dang woombly, if you know what I mean. You know what I mean, right? I think if you point at any of the kart racers on the N64, you'll find a plethora of people that hate the steering in any one of them. Like, I think that Mario Kart 64's controls are Star Wars Episode 2, which is another word for dog crap. And I think that Diddy Kong Racing's controls feel ever so off too. But at the end of the day, both of these games are still easy enough to control if you put enough time into them. LEGO Racers controls are probably the worst out of all the racing games I've reviewed on the N64. One thing that I noticed is that all the vehicles are pretty top heavy, and getting used to that was a chore. The vehicles feel so unnatural to turn, and I still wasn't used to the steering by the time that I got to the second to last circuit. It's so easy to mess up a turn ever so slightly, so then you miss things like items or get put into a stage hazard or hit a wall. It's awful. I can't tell if the controls are too touchy or not touchy enough. One way to describe it is that it feels like you're actually driving a brick. Skit. Usually I'm fine with giving questionable controls in racing games a pass, because you'll get used to them. That's just the nature of racing games. But something about LEGO Racers is just off. Like in other games of this nature, there are items and power-ups that you can collect in the level to use. They're all pretty basic, and you get them by getting these bricks. There's the boost, the missile, the oil slick, and the shield. It's not just limited to these though, because you can get these white bricks, which will power up your item to give you things like multiple missiles that track, a boost that allows you to just fly around the course, a longer shield, and this curse thing that reverses your controls. It's great. I love this idea, and I like it a lot better in this game than Diddy Kong Racing's power-ups. These ones feel incredibly unique from one another. There's one tiny problem with this though. It's just a tiny problem. A really tiny problem. A really, really tiny problem. That's actually an incredibly huge problem. The fully powered up boost is broken and easily abused. When you fully power up the boost, you get to warp a considerable distance ahead on the track. And when I say considerable, I mean considerable. Skip. In fact, the warp is so good that going for literally anything but the boost to get the warp is really dumb and a waste of time. A lot of times, if I didn't get the warp, then I'd lose. I'd spend almost all of my races looking for boost bricks and the white bricks to power it up. You don't have to focus on any other brick at all. Races are spent just trying to get this broken item. I think that if they would have powered this down just a tad bit as a way to balance out the weapons, then everything would have been fine and dandy. But nope. The other power-ups are pretty cool, and sometimes it's good to use them if you could do it quickly so then you could just go boost hunting. But that's pretty much it. I have two huge issues with this game, which are two huge issues that I had from Mario Kart 64 and Diddy Kong Racing, except one issue per game. The first issue is that there seems to be a ridiculous amount of rubber banding in this game, which is arguably the biggest issue in Mario Kart 64. At least what happens in LEGO Racers comes off like rubber banding. There's a rival that you have during the circuit races, and no matter how good you do, they'll be right on your tail. With that said though, if you do horrible, your rival will go way ahead of you. Like, really far ahead of you. What's the point of all the other racers if this guy is the only person you're supposed to be concerned about? Whatever. Just let it go. The next issue is something that I can't stand about Diddy Kong Racing. I got this sense from LEGO Racers that the races were predetermined to a degree. I started to notice that the same things were happening at the very beginning of races. The other racers would move in the exact same formation that they did the last 3 times. So the game started to feel like less of a racing game and more of a puzzle game. I just had to figure out how the other characters would move around the stage so I could avoid their attacks and such. This is how almost all of Diddy Kong Racing is, and it really bothers me. I don't really think that it's that much of an issue in the grand scheme of things. There are no rules that racing games can't be this way, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't bother me personally. Skit. Let's talk about all the cool bonus modes in the game. That was slight sarcasm. First up is Build, which is where you get to build your own race car. It's one of the things in this game that makes it truly stand out, and I love whenever games allow you to be creative. I have a few problems with it though. I wish that it would show you vehicle stats so you could monitor how good or bad your vehicle is. I would build a vehicle and it would totally suck, and I wouldn't be sure why. And then I'd build another vehicle and it'd be great, and I just don't know how I did it. Another thing is that it's not very intuitive. Getting through the menu is really a hassle because buttons just don't do things that you think they do. Instead of selecting a piece to use, I'd actually switch to different sets, and this was just annoying. I built quite a bit of vehicles in this game, and every time that I did, I had to relearn how to use this builder. You get to build your own personal Lego man too, and this was perfect in execution. Very simple and easy to understand. Even an idiot could do it. Oh no. Just the important stuff was difficult. You know, the vehicle? Like mentioned before, this is the mode that really stands out. Everything else is your typical racing game fare, which is where you do a single race on any track that you have unlocked. It's really good for practice. There's Versus Race, which is where you get to race with friends. The frame rate is a little crappy here, but other than that, I think it functions just like it should. And then there is Time Race, or as normal video games like to call it, Time Trials. If you like time trials, then here you go. This is actually where I like to play a lot of the game. There wasn't a lot of stress here, so it's a good place to attempt to learn the crappy steering. Skit. Out of the racing games that I've reviewed so far, I'd argue that this game does its visuals the best. It's got unique vehicles to look at, the levels are pretty detailed and have small things about them that add a nice touch, and since the game is all LEGO, the blocky look on the N64 is perfect. I know that some people have pointed out that the frame rate is kind of wonky, but that was hardly an issue for me. I never really noticed it with the exception of multiplayer. It can be pretty bad in multiplayer. I don't really have much else to say about the visuals because I honestly think that they look great. The music in this game isn't bad either. If I'm being honest though, I don't really like the music, almost at all. I'm not saying it's bad because it's actually pretty good for what it's worth. The music just very much does not resonate with me. It's a little too childish for me. Childish music fits perfectly in a LEGO game though, and I really appreciate that. The music during the courses is pretty good, but I think that the sound mixing kind of makes it to where you can't really hear the music. That's kind of an issue. I'm pretty positive that each track got its own tune, and I think that that kind of polish deserves to be recognized. It's good music and a very taken care of soundtrack altogether, but I won't be listening to it at my own leisure anytime soon. Skit. I don't think LEGO Racers is very good. In fact, I think that when you look at all the elements of LEGO Racers, you get a below average game. The controls are bad, and unfortunately, the levels aren't good enough to really save the game in my eyes. I really like the hidden areas and shortcuts, but those aren't really enough for me to say that all the tracks are good. And while I do love the power-up system in this game, I can't ignore how broken the warp is. The music is enjoyable and technically sound to an extent, and with the exception of a few moments, the visuals do their job very well. But the two most important parts of the game don't do what they need to do to make a good racing game. If you enjoy LEGO Racers, that's fine. I do recommend giving it a go if you're willing. Just don't expect the best experience because the game hasn't necessarily held up.